the Rent Guideline Board's first meeting of 2015. Welcome to all who have attended in the past, and welcome to anyone for whom it's their first meeting. My name is Rachel Godsall, I'm the chair of the board, and this is the first in a series of public meetings and hearings to determine the renewal lease adjustments for rent-stabilized housing in New York City, with leases commencing or being renewed on or after October 1st, 2015, and on or before September 30th, 2016. So it's very exciting. On behalf of the board, I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome our two new public members, Audited and Helen Shaw, and our new owner representative, Scott Walsh. I look forward to working with each of you, and I'm sure you'll find that you're joining a fabulous group of individual board members and amazing staff, RGB staff, and again, it's actually an honor to be part of this board, and we're thrilled that you're part of it, so hope that you are too. I would like to take roll call, so please respond if present. Harvey Epstein.
Present.
Steve Platts.
Present.
Shayla Garcia. Present. Cecilia Hossa. Present. Sylvia Roman.
Present.
Helen Shaw. Present. Scott Walsh.
Present.
Sarah Willard. Do you like the full name, Sarah Willard?
You can just call me Sarah Willard.
Sarah Willard.
That's fine. Present.
And Rachel Godsall, also present. So with the arrival of new members, we also are saying goodbye to others. They're not present here today, but I would be remiss if I didn't recognize the contributions of the three members who've now left our board, Magna Cruz, Carol Shine, and David White. They served for many years. Their dedication to the board was unwavering, and we thank them for their service. In your folder, you'll find a copy of the 2015 Income and Expense Study, which will be presented today by Brian Hoberman. After the staff presentation, we'll be hearing testimony from Elizabeth Gomer, the HPD Acting Assistant Commissioner for Research and Evaluation. Ms. Gomer will present summary statistics from the 2014 Housing Vacancy Survey, as well as the status of other HPD programs and initiatives, and a copy of the selected initial findings of the 2015 NYC Housing Vacancy Survey is in your folder. So for those in the audience, as well as, of course, the board, our next meeting will be here. Okay, I think this is a municipal building, and it's also the Landmark Preservation Commission conference room on April 2nd, starting at 9:30 a.m. Staff will be presenting the 2015 Income and Affordability Study and the 2015 Mortgage Survey Report. Of enormous importance to all of us, the preliminary vote for rent-stabilized renewal lease adjustments will be held on April 29th at the CUNY Graduate Center, 365 Fifth Avenue in Manhattan. There are copies of the most current 2015 meeting schedule in your folders, and it can also be found on the website nycrgb.org. Copies of the schedule are here today. Please note that the public hearings and final vote meetings are being finalized, and we will release those to the public as soon as possible, at the very latest within a few weeks. This is important. This is new. Harvey, you will love this. For anyone interested in receiving email updates, anyone interested in receiving email updates about upcoming RGB meetings and hearings, please take one of our flyers home today, or you can sign up by going on the board's homepage. So I'd like to thank the staff for putting this in place.
Yeah, thank you.
So this will be a way that people can have automatic, sort of individualized receipts of anything having to do with the RGB, and Shayla's holding up. Very excited.
I can go home now. I'm just...
Your work is done. Please note that the annual filing of the Conflict of Interest Board Financial Disclosure Report will run from April 16, 2015 through May 1st, 2015. Individual packets for board members should be ready prior to our April 2nd meeting. Unless otherwise directed, we'll distribute the packets at the next meeting. The Conflict of Interest Board requires that we distribute their notices to New York City public servants, having substantial policy discretion for our members. And needless to say, and I'm sure the audience will agree, we have discretion that is important, and therefore it's important that we ensure that we have no conflicts of interest. This notice is in your folders. Also in your folders, you'll find the non-public per diem forms. Any questions on that, please? I'll speak to Andrew. So I am now delighted to introduce Brian Hoberman, the RGB Research Director, to present the 2015 Income and Expense Study. And there are copies of the report here today, and it will be made available on our website after the meeting. Steve?
Excuse me, Brian. The conflict of interest, is that online that we fill out? Is that long 70-page nonsense?
Yes.
And it's the same all over again, or is it a renewal?
For the ones doing it the second time,
all the information is in there. So is saved in there. So if your answers have not changed, you just go skim down through it and see. So it's much easier the second, third, fourth, fifth, unless you win the lottery.
I wish the new members good luck with their forms.
But the packets are, again, for the new members, it gives you a temporary password to get in, and then you have to change it, so you get a little packet, you open it up. So, anyway.
Thank you.
Before we start, any other questions, comments? Jubilance at the beginning of the session?
Yeah.
All right, Brian.
Could I ask a quick question? I was wondering, I know last year we also talked about translation services and concern about how that was done last year. I'm wondering if we talked about, how it might effectuate a different, like using different people or a different process to ensure appropriate translation this year?
Absolutely. To the extent that we have any suggestions of services that we could use, please let the staff know, and we will do our absolute best to ensure the translation is as efficient and accessible as possible. Obviously, that's a crucial point of things. Okay, Brian?
Okay, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to the board members returning and to the new board members and to the public. I will present the 2015 Income and Expense Study.
Sorry, Brian, can you talk about
Sure. Okay, good morning, everyone. I will now present the 2015 Income and Expense Study. The 2015 Income and Expense Study analyzes data from real property income and expense filings. These forms were submitted to the Department of Finance in 2014 and reflect conditions during 2013. We also compare this data with filings from the prior year. Before I go into detail, here are the major findings of the study. On average, in stabilized buildings between 2012 and 2013, both rental income and total income increased by 4.5%. Operating costs increased by 5%, and net operating income grew by 3.4%. I will now go on to discuss the findings of the study in more detail. First, I'll briefly review the methodology used in this study. Local Law 63, enacted in 1986, requires building owners to file RPIE forms with the Department of Finance annually, with some exceptions. These include condos and other kinds of buildings smaller than 11 units, or buildings that have an assessed value of under $40,000. The Department of Finance matched 2014 RPIE filings, which describe 2013 conditions, with a list of rent-stabilized buildings that registered with the New York State Division of Housing and Community Renewal. Then the data was screened for errors, and those records were removed. The two data sets created were a cross-sectional sample of almost 14,600 buildings containing over 660,000 units. This data is used to compute average revenues and costs for a moment-in-time view. And we also have a longitudinal sample, which consists of over 12,600 buildings containing almost 587,000 units. This encompasses 2 years' worth of RPIE filings. In 2013, rent-stabilized property owners collected monthly rent averaging $1,182 per unit. Similar to prior years, units in pre-war buildings rented for less on average, $1,120 per month, than those in post-war buildings at $1,351 per month. At the borough level, the average monthly rents in stabilized buildings were $1,638 in Manhattan, $1,123 in Queens, $1,020 in Brooklyn, $964 in Staten Island, and $874 in the Bronx. Looking at New York City, if you exclude core Manhattan, rent was $1,029. Looking at median figures, the median rent citywide was $1,038. Many stabilized buildings supplement their rental income by selling services to tenants. This includes laundry facilities and parking fees. And they also sometimes rent out commercial space. In 2013, rent-stabilized owners in New York City earned on average $1,337 in gross income per unit per month, with pre-war buildings earning less, $1,272, and units in post-war buildings earning more, $1,517 per unit. By borough, Manhattan income was the highest, with an average income of $1,962. And the other boroughs, Queens averaged $1,195, Brooklyn's average was $1,097, Staten Island averaged $1,069, and the Bronx averaged income was $977. In New York City, excluding core Manhattan, the average income was $1,111. And if you look at median incomes, the citywide median was $1,127. This graph shows that average monthly rent and income were highest in core Manhattan and lowest in the Bronx. At the top of the graph is core and upper Manhattan, and the city without core Manhattan is shown at the bottom. Income is in green and rent is in red. And all the graphs and charts that are in the presentation are also in the report if you have trouble reading the slides. The sale of services and commercial income accounts for 11.6% of the total income earned by rent-stabilized building owners in 2013. That's down from 11.9% in the prior year. Core Manhattan owners received the largest share of their income from these sources at 17.5%. In the rest of the city, gross income from services accounted for a smaller proportion of total income. It was 14% in Upper Manhattan, 10.5% in the Bronx, 9.9% in Staten Island, 7% in Brooklyn, and 6% in Queens. Another data source, the New York State Division of Housing and Community Renewal, DHCR, annual registration data provides important comparative rent data to the collected rents stated in RPIE filings. The comparison of the collected RPIE rents to the DHCR rents is a good indicator of the overall rental market and reflects both preferential rents as well as vacancy and collection losses. In comparing annual RPIE and DHCR average rents, the gap between the two in 2013 was 24.5%, which is indicated by the average RPIE rent of $1,182 and DHCR's average stabilized rent of $1,566. This graph shows the comparison between RPIE rents and rents registered with DHCR since 1990. The DHCR rents are legal rents, or in other words, the maximum amount that can be charged in rent-stabilized apartments. While we know that because of vacancy and collection losses and market forces, that can cause owners to charge lower preferential rents, owners never collect 100% of what can legally be charged for a unit. This graph shows that on average, owners collected 75.5% of DHCR rents, or the maximum allowed in 2013. It's down slightly from 76% in 2012. Gap shows a small decline from the prior year, which indicates that building owners are collecting a lower proportion of their legal rent rolls. Now we'll move on to expenses. The average monthly operating cost for units in stabilized buildings was $884 in 2013. Costs were lower in units in pre-war structures, $856, and higher among post-war buildings, $959. Geographically, the average costs were highest in Manhattan at $1,244. And lower in Queens, $787, Staten Island, $727, the Bronx, $718, and in Brooklyn, $713. The average monthly operating cost for stabilized building owners in New York City, excluding core Manhattan, reduces the city average to $750. In 1992, the Department of Finance audited expenses reported by building owners on RPIE forms and found that the costs were overstated by about 8% on average. Adjusting the costs in 2013, cross-sectional RPIE data by about 8% results in an average citywide cost of $812 per unit. Operating expenses in buildings without commercial space are generally lower than in buildings with commercial space. The figures noted on the slides up to this point include expenses for buildings with commercial space. However, in our analysis, we can just look at the buildings without commercial space, and we found an average monthly audited cost of $749 per unit citywide for those buildings. Also looking at median costs, which we don't audit, The citywide median monthly O&M expenses were $787, with Manhattan having the highest median costs at $1,046, and Staten Island having the lowest at $655. In between were Queens at $734, the Bronx $703, and Brooklyn $668. This graph breaks down expenses by component and further splits them into pre- and post-war categories. Similar to prior years, the largest share of expenses went towards taxes, followed by maintenance, administrative costs, and fuel. In post-war buildings, which are indicated in this graph in green, they spent more on taxes, administration, labor, utilities, and miscellaneous costs, while pre-war buildings, shown in the graph in blue, spent more than average on maintenance, fuel, and insurance. And we have the average expenses for all stabilized buildings in the graph in red. In 2013, 6.8% of buildings were found to have operating and maintenance costs greater than gross income, which are considered distressed. That was slightly higher than the 6.6% found in the prior year, and the first increase in the proportion of distressed properties in 5 years. Most distressed buildings are pre-war. Just 6.4% of distressed buildings were built after 1946. This graph shows the proportion of distressed buildings declining through most of the 1990s, but the proportion began to climb in 1999. However, in recent years, the share of distressed properties in our cross-sectional sample fell in most years, though it increased in 2013, up 0.2 percentage points to 6.6%. Even with the increase, the proportion of distressed buildings is still well below the proportion of just 5 years ago when 12.8% were distressed. There's no direct way to measure profit in the rent-stabilized buildings in this study. We would need to know a great deal of information, of individual building information, such as debt service, mortgage interest rates, etc., and that is not available. Instead, we have two surrogate measures for profit: net operating income and cost to rent and income ratios. First, we'll look at net operating income. The amount of income remaining after O&M expenses are paid, that is, used for financing buildings, making improvements, and pre-income tax profits, is referred to as net operating income, NOI. NOI is a good indicator of a building's financial health. In 2013, rent-stabilized apartments averaged $454 of net income per unit per month, while units in pre-war buildings on average earned less, $416 per month, and units in post-war buildings earned more, $557 per month. Average NOI per unit in residential-only buildings was $404, 11.1% less than the average for all rent-stabilized buildings. In 2013, average NOI was significantly different by borough. Manhattan had the highest NOI at $718, with core Manhattan units having significantly higher NOI at $956 than upper Manhattan units, which on average earned $392 per month. In the other boroughs, NOI in Queens was $408, followed by Brooklyn at $383, Staten Island at $342, and the Bronx at $259. Units in New York City, excluding core Manhattan, had an average monthly NOI of $361. The second surrogate measure for profit is the cost to rent and cost to income ratios, which reveal how well the rent-stabilized stock is doing. Cost-to-income ratios can be used as a tool to evaluate a building's financial health, making the assumption that buildings are better off by spending a lower percentage of revenue on expenses. In this graph, the audited cost-to-income ratio is shown in green, the bottom line in the graph. In 2013, operating costs were 60.7% of gross income, 0.2 percentage points higher than the prior year. This means that owners, on average, spent on costs a little more than 60.5 cents of each dollar of revenue that they earned. Looking at unaudited expenses, the cost-to-income ratio was 66.1% in the most recent year. This graph shows the proportion of total income spent on audited operating costs since 1990. After falling for several years, it began increasing in 1999, rising until 2005, and it has fallen in most years since then, though it edged upward in the latest year. The cost-to-rent ratio, which is shown in red, has followed a similar trajectory, edging up to 68.7% in the current year. If we use unaudited expenses, the cost-to-rent ratio was 74.8%. We also analyzed income and expense data for buildings with fewer than 11 units. A total of 979 buildings with fewer than 11 units voluntarily filed RPIE forms. The citywide, the average cost-to-income ratio for these buildings was 75%, with an unaudited ratio of 81.7%. In an analysis of the distribution of operating costs in relation to total income in buildings by decile, it may be useful to examine the percentage of buildings with cost-to-income ratios at or below certain levels. The Department of Finance calculated decile levels, and in examining them, for instance, decile statistics reveal that half of all rent-stabilized buildings citywide have unaudited cost-to-income ratios of 0.67 or less. This means that half the building owners spent no more than 67 cents out of every dollar of revenue on operating and maintenance costs in 2013. Another example, if you look at the 70% decile level citywide, 7 out of 10 buildings paid no more than 77 cents of every dollar of revenue on operating maintenance costs, and 3 of 10 paid more. The complete table of all 10 deciles citywide and by borough can be found in the report in Appendix 8. This slide breaks out rent, income, costs, and NOI figures between core Manhattan on the left and the city with the core excluded on the right. As the graph shows, average income, rent, costs, and NOI are a great deal higher in core Manhattan compared to the rest of the city. When looking at the cost-to-income ratios, the difference between the two demonstrates that core Manhattan owners spend, when compared to owners from the rest of the city, about 6.5 cents less of every dollar earned. This next graph is useful because it shows the change in income, rents, expenses, and NOI citywide over a 24-year period and takes inflation into account as well. During this period, income, which is in blue and on the top, was up an inflation-adjusted 27.9%. Rent, the second line from the top in green, was up 26.4%. Costs, the third line in yellow, was up 24.7%. And net operating income, NOI, represented by the bottom red line, increased over the period by 34.4%. You have to note that this is an inflation-adjusted point-to-point comparison, where the changes are shown over this period from 1990, when a significant RPI sample size became available, through 2013, which is the most recent year data is available. These graphs represent the same time period as the graph on the previous slide, but it breaks it down by borough. These graphs show that while the actual inflation-adjusted income, rent, costs, and NOI figures are far higher in Manhattan, the percentage increase in NOI was not the highest in Manhattan. In fact, Brooklyn, at the top right, has seen the largest NOI increase over this period, up 78%. Queens, at the bottom left, had the second highest NOI increase, up 51%, followed by Manhattan, at the top left, up 36%, and the Bronx, in the bottom right graph, up 30%. The NOI up 30%. Okay, now I'll move on to the second part of the income and expense study. That's the longitudinal analysis. The longitudinal sample encompasses properties that filed RPIE forms reflecting conditions in both 2012 and 2013. By doing the longitudinal analysis, we can more accurately track changes from year to year as the same buildings are being analyzed. Average rent collections in stabilized buildings rose by 4.5% in 2013 citywide. Rent collections in pre-war buildings rose 4.8%, more than in post-war buildings, which increased 3.9%. Rent collections increased the most among smaller 11 to 19 unit buildings, up 5.6%. Mid-sized 20 to 99 unit buildings rose 4.4%, while rents grew 4.1% among the largest 100 or more unit buildings. If we look at median rent citywide, it was 4.2%. Looking at rent collections throughout the city, we break it down by community district. Every community district saw a rent increase from 2012 to 2013. The Mott Haven, Port Morris area of the Bronx rose the most of any community district, up 9.3%, followed by Midtown Manhattan, which grew 6.4%. Also among the largest rent increases were 3 Brooklyn neighborhoods, Williamsburg, Greenpoint, South Crown Heights, and Flatlands, Canarsie, were each up 6.2%. The Queens neighborhood seeing the largest increase was Astoria, up 5.8%. The average total income collected in rent-stabilized buildings, comprising apartment rents, commercial rents, and sale of services, increased by 4.5% from 2012 to 2013. Revenues rose faster in pre-war buildings, up 4.6%, than in post-war buildings, up 4.1%. Brooklyn saw the highest growth in income, rising 4.9%, followed by the Bronx, up 4.4%. Queens and Manhattan each saw income rise 4.3%, and Staten Island was up 3.8%. The median growth in income citywide was 4.6%. Average expenses in stabilized buildings citywide increased 5% from 2012 to 2013. However, the change in operating costs varied by building age and by borough. Newer, post-war buildings saw expenses increase 5.3%, while pre-war buildings saw expenses increase 4.9%. Breaking down the change in costs by borough, costs rose the most on Staten Island, up 7.9%, while costs rose 5.4% in Manhattan, 5% in Brooklyn, and both 4.5% in both the Bronx and Queens. Citywide, median expenses rose 5%. It can also be useful to compare the cost changes calculated from RPIE data with the price and cost data from the RGB's Price Index of Operating Costs, the PIOC, which we have adjusted to match the time periods between the two. In this graph, the adjusted price index is in red and the RPIE data is in green. As the graph shows, income and expense data grew at different rates than the price index in some years since 1990. In the most recent year, 2013, the adjusted PIOC rose by 5.4%, while RPIE costs rose by 5%. Overall, cumulative growth since 1990 in owner costs, as measured by the two indices, have varied. Overall nominal costs measured in the PIOC increased at a greater rate, 179.9%, compared to RPIE data, which increased 150.6% over this period. Between 2012 and 2013, the proportion of gross income spent on audited expenses, that's the O&M cost-income ratio, rose 0.3 percentage points. The proportion of rental income used for audited expenses, that's the O&M cost-to-rent ratio, increased as well, also up the same incremental 0.3 percentage points. Operating income per unit on average in rent-stabilized buildings increased by 3.4% citywide from 2012 to 2013. It was the 9th consecutive year that NOI has increased. NOI growth was stronger in pre-war buildings, up 4.1%, than among post-war buildings, which rose 2%. All but one borough saw NOI increase, with Brooklyn seeing the largest increase, up 4.8%, while NOI rose 4% in the Bronx, 3.8% in Queens, and 2.6% in Manhattan. By contrast, NOI declined 4% on Staten Island. And if you look within Manhattan, core Manhattan NOI increased by 3.2%, while it rose 0.8% in upper Manhattan. Looking at the community district level, change in NOI varied widely, with 3/4 of neighborhoods experiencing increases in NOI. Three neighborhoods seeing the largest growth in NOI were all in the Bronx, with East Tremont, Belmont rising 19.9%, Mott Haven, Port Morris up 15.3%, and the Hunts Point, Longwood neighborhood up 11.7%. The next two largest increases in the city were in two Brooklyn neighborhoods, with Williamsburg Greenpoint up 10.5% and East Flatbush up 9.8%. The Queens neighborhood seeing the largest increase was Forest Hills Rego Park, up 8.8%, and the Manhattan neighborhood seeing the largest increase was in the Village, up 6.7%. On the other hand, 23% of neighborhoods saw NOI decline from 2012 to 2013. The largest decline was in Jamaica, Queens, down 9.9%, followed by the North Shore of Staten Island, down 4.6%, Pelham Parkway in the Bronx, down 4%, and the Morningside Heights, Hamilton Heights district of Manhattan, down 3.2%. The largest decline in Brooklyn was in Brownsville, Ocean Hill, falling 3.1%. This table lists the average annual change in rent, income, expenses, and net operating income from 1990 to the present, and it's also reproduced in the report on page 15. To summarize the findings of the income and expense study, on the bottom row, from 2012 to 2013, citywide rent and revenue collections each increased 4.5%, and expenses rose by 5%. And despite the greater rate of increase in expenses, net operating income citywide increased by 3.4%. This was the 9th consecutive year that NOI has increased. Thank you, and I will now take any questions you may have.
Thank you, Brian. Any questions from the board?
Thank you, Brian. Just in terms of methodology, more or less consistently you sort of break down operating costs, rent collections, and so forth around pre-war and post-war, but you don't do that consistently around the size of the property. And I know that some of the numbers sort of on the map reflect sort of smaller buildings, larger buildings. I'm just curious what's the logic in that, or why it seems to, I don't know if it is inconsistent, but it seems to be a little inconsistent. I'm just curious what your thought is.
Oh, you mean whether or not we discuss pre- and post-war?
Yeah, I don't, it seems, it's more salient if we did large versus small as opposed to pre-war as post-war. I'm just curious why.
I think well, we choose what we report, but I think it's all in the appendices. If you look, I think it's all broken down by those categories. So you can get it there if you want.
And one other question, then I'll stop. On page 6, in the first paragraph, you know, it's basically the number of ways rents may be raised beyond the RGB guidelines in that sort of graph. And I know it's deregulation of units, increase in preferential rates and MCIs. Do you know the breakdown that what percentages are related to MCIs, what's related to regulation of the apartments, and what percentages?
There's no way to know, unfortunately. No, it's not. DHCR doesn't analyze the data, and we can't get it from Department of Finance.
Because again, the maps show, like in the Bronx and Mott Haven and elsewhere with larger buildings, I assume there are MCIs there, but there's no way to really tell.
We can't tell from the data we have.
Okay.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Thanks, Brian. A couple quick questions. I know at the end you raised the issue of rental income is up 4.5%, costs are up 5%, but then NOI continued to, basically the NOI continued to rise. Can you tell us why, if you think 4.5 was just the income rate and the cost went up by 5%, how did we get an NOI increase of over?
Right. Yeah, that could be a little confusing. It's because the income and rent levels are higher as a dollar figure than the cost levels. So even if the percentage increase in cost is higher, because you're talking about a smaller dollar amount, the NOI can still be positive.
So the percentages are just so it could be like a 5% increase on $100 versus $1 million on rent, 4.5%, it'll be a larger value.
Yeah, that would be the extreme example, yeah.
Oh, yeah,
But that's what happens in this case.
Great. And you mentioned the legal rent versus registered rent. I want to clearly, there's a distinguishment between what's registered with GHCR as what the owners put as the legal rent, but it may not be determined to be legal rent, right? So
Registered and legal, I think, are the same thing generally.
well, I think the only distinction is it's what the owner registers, whether GHCR through an auditing process determines that's the legal rent or not. It may not be legal, it just be the registered rent.
The data from DHCR is just what's registered. If a tenant files an overcharge complaint, they would investigate whether it's a legal or proper rent that's being paid, but normally, in most cases, they don't look into that.
And just another quick question. You said commercial income is down, slightly down, the commercial income that the landlords received.
Well, the proportion of the total income.
So that just means they're getting more of the more increase in NOI, more increase was coming from the residential income, not the commercial income? Is that the conclusion to make?
I mean, you can interpret it how you like. I'm not sure if I would say that necessarily, but it just means a lower proportion of the total income was from commercial rent.
Great. Thank you.
Other questions?
Thank you very much for this. Your citywide income, rents, costs, and NOI after inflation graph, do you also have, that's a point-to-point, so that's the entire growth rate over that, how many year period? 24-year period, correct, total growth?
Yes.
Okay. Do you have that on a weighted average per year figure that you can share with the team?
Yeah, we have that available. I think it's not in the report, but I think it may be available.
Could you, for the next meeting, do you mind distributing that?
Sure.
That would be great.
Other questions? I just had one quick question.
So you just showed the graph that showed a pretty wide variation between costs as measured by the PIOC versus the RPIE data. I mean, kind of wild variation. So could you explain a little bit what could explain those variations?
Well, the PIOC measures costs. It's not an actual measure of what is being spent. Like this report measures the actual expenses paid by rent-stabilized building owners. Andrew probably can talk a little bit more about it since he does the PIOC.
Yeah, excuse me. The first difference is there are two different indices. One is a combination cost price index. So we are measuring changes in price or changes in costs. Whereas the income and expense are actual income and actual expense reported by owners. The RPIE does not include, however, smaller buildings that are 10 or fewer units. So that also adds to some of what's going on there, I believe. The price index also doesn't take into account necessarily owner spending patterns. If, during the recession, for example, during the recession, the price index was measuring those price changes that were going up at a higher rate than owners were actually spending because there was, because of recession. So we don't always, the indices aren't always going to match. As you may recall, for those on the board last year, we actually re-weighted the price index using the I&E weights, which I think is revealing that this year the I&E and the PIOC are actually quite close. So I feel that the change in that weight also is going to go forward with those two indices starting to be more, the changes will be closer than they have in the past. So those are some of the things that are going on that would explain those differences.
What might also be helpful to keep in mind is the reason to have the two different indices is the RPIE data is necessarily backward-looking, and the goal of the PIOC is to look at what the price increases for a particular service will be based upon the current information that can be obtained through a survey. And so the ideal is to try and figure out, based upon those 9 bits of information, what is likely to happen, but we're of course projecting forward. And so it's again sort of the best attempt to put data in front of the board that both reflects, as Andrew suggested, the actual expenses that landlords report, although we wish we could have the information from the smaller units that it's not required and so it's difficult to obtain, and then what vendors are saying they will actually charge going forward. And so again, we're going to put this together and reach the most informed conclusion that we can. Thank you. Any other questions before we hear from Ms. Dahmer from, yes?
You're on.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, Brian, so one question for the longitudinal study. I wonder if it might be possible to get a copy of some of them broken down by community district. So like I'm looking at the color coding, and some of the community districts have different kind of changes for the different charts, but they don't necessarily line up between the two. And so I'm just kind of curious what's going on at the community district level.
Sure, we can provide that to you, sure.
That'd be helpful. Thanks.
All right, are there no further questions? Thank you so much, Brian.
Okay, thank you.